I had an interesting experience this week with a lady who called me and told me about an interaction with her husband. And because of her, I'm going to start a whole series of blogs just called Man Speak, Man Language, Man Talk, because guys communicate apparently in a different language than women understand, especially when it comes to anything to do with love, which of course would make a meaningful interaction impossible. So she told me that, her husband been for the last several days really anxious, and so semi-following my instructions, she took his face in her hands and said, "I love you. I'm right here for you." And he said, understandably and with some caution, which he's had all of his life, he said, "I don't trust that yet." She was somewhat perplexed by that, maybe a little offended, though not much. But I said, the main thing is, you don't understand what he just said. He does trust you. Now, you got to know somebody before you can say this, but he does trust you. He's beginning to. Now, how do I know? He brought up the word trust. Guys don't bring up stuff they're not thinking about. And so he brought up the word trust because he said, "I don't trust you yet." But he brought up the possibility that he would. Men are required to be tentative and almost dismissive, I wrote to her, when they're talking about tenderness, including trust. So "I don't trust you" actually means, in man talk, which is admittedly a somewhat primitive and barbaric language, really means I don't trust you completely, because that would expose me to possible pain. And if I trusted you, well, there is the possibility that could also make me look like a girl, which only girls use words like that, and that would be unthinkable. The truth is, I do trust you some, but I'm not quite ready to be vulnerable to the point where I would admit it. Trusting somebody and admitting it are two vastly different things. That would require the removal for a man of all doubt whatever. And what he was saying is, I've never seen that as a possibility, not even with guys. So, of course, I trust you to some extent, and I know this because I know both of you, and I know the behavior of both of you lately. This is me speaking now. But now, back to him. Of course, I trust you to some extent, or I wouldn't have brought up the subject. No kidding. That is the man translation of "I don't trust that yet." Now, that kind of changes the meaning of what he says quite a bit, doesn't it? She writes back, "This is hilarious and amazing." She said in all caps, which she doesn't normally do, "I did not know that you all had a separate language. I really didn't. Duh. I thought that was like animal kingdom stuff. Seriously, blind, deaf, and dumb here." So no wonder it doesn't work when I say things like, "How can I help you?" "Wait, I can't. I don't know your language." Yeah, and to make it worse, we don't know that we have a separate language. We men, we don't know that. And we can't translate it for you. If you'd stopped him right there and said, "Could you translate that into, say like English or woman?" It's all he knows, kid. We can't translate it for you, and we're kind of amazed that you don't understand us. And that makes us alone. She said, and here I was thinking that her husband, Max, was so evolved in his expression. But this rings true, what you're telling me. It finally makes sense of so many things for how he acts and responds to me. This explains why every time he caught me being sweet and tender to our young boys when they were just little, he would feel compelled to interject some sort of gruff, manly thing. Of course, not only do we have a separate language, but we can't even pretend to understand some of the words that you guys use, like Sweet? No. We have to act totally bewildered or disgusted that you would use a word like that. A guy would fall over dead before he'd use the word sweet. You see women gather around YouTube all the time and go, oh, isn't that just so sweet? You may not have noticed, but guys don't do that. Ever. It's not in our vocabulary. So we have to act bewildered or disgusted or inject something gruff or, hock a loogie and spit it on the ground or, do something really manly. We just can't do that kind of stuff. Then she continued. Then he took me aside when I would do something sweet with the boys and told me I was coddling them. And her comment was, well, honey, the boy is 2.5 years old. And I don't mind doing his laundry for another few months. Dang. See, your husband is thinking 2.5, the boy should be driving by now. The only reason that he can't is because they make the trucks too big for him. He should be looking for a job. He should have a girlfriend. The lady writing said, after the age of 8 or 9, my husband forbid me to touch their dirty underwear. This just explains so much, and so much I didn't understand about him. Guys are pretty crazy about our pretended over masculinity. Sorry, but if you don't understand this, guys will be forever a mystery to you. If you do, we're very easy to understand because our vocabulary is very limited. No kidding. Good. More. You said, I went for a walk with him this morning before work, which has never happened in 25 years. Now, this lady had an intervention several months ago and has just melted this guy. I'm going to pause for a long parenthesis here, just say something, because I've been having a number of discussions with women about this lately. They're concerned that their husbands or their boyfriends aren't involved in doing real love. On the whole, most guys don't do real love. All you care about is whether they're willing to receive it and be taught about it by you. That they're willing to listen to what you need and that they're willing to receive what you give them. That's all you care about. This great, big, tough, rough guy who is in the quintessential man's occupation has never gone on a walk with his wife in 25 years before work, because once he gets up, work, got to go to work. She would say, you want to go for work? Got to go to work. Because that's what men do. They go to work. And here he is, he's going on a walk with her. And she said already this morning, and he's been at work for half an hour, he sent me a text from work saying that he loved our walk this morning. Wow. So let me translate that from Man Talk. That text alone says, honey, I loved being with you. Please keep loving me. I need you. Yeah, I know. You're all going, I enjoyed our walk this morning, says all that. Because there's no way we're going to say all that other stuff because it's too sweet. So she concludes, thank you for decoding my husband's words for me last night, none of which I understood until you told me. So really you're saying that he's simultaneously saying, I don't trust you, while he's saying, I need you so bad I can't breathe. Yes, that's what he's saying. And I'll be doing blogs on this, on how to understand Man Talk. It's really pretty easy. The Man Talk dictionary is extremely small. We like small words, I'm right, that's stupid, give me more. I hate that. We grunt a lot. It's going to be fun to do. And delightful to get to see this woman open up to understanding her husband, understanding him and accepting it, instead of criticizing him and finding his limited ability to be expressive stupid. No, it's just how he is. It's how he was raised. I know a man, Carl, we'll call him just for fun. who found a woman in real love who is a jewel of a human being. As I said to him, as I was talking to the two of them on a Skype call one day, I looked at him as he was expressing some doubts about her. He had, had a cheating partner before. And I said, this woman sitting next to you, because I know her well, is not your ex-partner. In fact, if you look all of your life, you will never do better than her. I don't know how you could give a much more ringing endorsement of somebody, and yet he continued to worry. He worried about her taking advantage of him, financially and otherwise. A fear of what is not real. He refused to put her before the demands of his children, who would, for example, when they would come over on holidays, demand that she be out of the house, or when they went somewhere, demand that she not be there. He put her second, third, and fourth all the time, despite hearing that this is the best you're ever going to do, and yet he wouldn't do anything to keep it. Pretty crazy. I finally said to her, Carl focuses on whatever will give him the least pain in the moment. That's what his whole life is about pain reduction. And that's a problem because it makes him captive to everything that's happening around him. See that? He lives in a prison wherever he goes. If he's with you and you're the only person in the room, then you're the most important. But if one of his kids makes a demand, then they're the most important because he's afraid of their rejection. If he thinks about money, then that becomes most important. If he thinks about his ex-partner, then his fear that you will be unfaithful like his ex-partner becomes the most important subject. Stuck. If you're trapped by fear of disapproval, or anything else for that matter, you don't really make choices. You don't really have a life. You just react. You're not alive. And you certainly can't be a partner. Because in order to be a partner, you have to actually be there. And as a result of his absolutely constant fears and unwillingness to face them, he lost her. He expressed enough regrets and fears that he finally walked away from the relationship. And he'll rationalize it. Actually, he already has. And he'll blame it on her, which he already has. And he'll regret it for the rest of his life. So he had the greatest imaginable jewel, and because of fear, he lost it. This is from a woman who has been here for an intervention. Every day since, it's been like watching somebody wake up from a coma, or somebody rise from the grave, or come out of a cave where they've been living all their life. In fact, she's actually said, my gosh, is this living? Is this what it's like? She described how her husband gets stressed about work and then he gets quiet, or he snaps at her for no reason, or he fusses and fumes generally. And in the past, she's always withdrawn or attacked or criticized, anything that would, of course, then throw gas on the fire. And since the intervention, she's touched him more. I talked about her a little bit last week, I think, or the week before. And absolutely refused to engage in any arguments. And he loves it. He's become a puppy. But he still sometimes does that other fearful stuff. And the other day he was being fearful, mostly about some stuff that was going on at work. In the past, she would always have made that about her. And I told her, it's about something else. It's not about you. He was being fearful and withdrawn and snippy, and nothing that she did worked. Touching him didn't make any difference. Looking him in the eye, asking him if he wanted something. So now what does she do? Anger is a poison in a relationship. It's death. It can't continue. If there were a fire in your house engulfing one wall, you would do anything it took to put the fire out, wouldn't you? If you had carefully prepared Christmas eggnog and that was the only thing on the table, you wouldn't hesitate to throw it on the fire. You would do anything. Well, the same is true with the fire of anger. It can't continue. So you can't be afraid. Because if you are, nothing good will happen. And the poison will continue to spread like a fire. So do what? Touch, like I suggested. Ask what you can do. Be gentle. Be loving. Pass in and out of the room and just sit next to him. Offer to get him whatever he'd like. But then if that doesn't work, something still has to be done. We still have a fire. It's not enough to say, well, I tried. I tried the fire extinguisher, but it was empty. Well, it doesn't really matter if your house is burned down. And it has to be stopped much sooner than you've been doing for pretty much all of us. Clearly, kindly, very kind tones, like the tones I'm using now. But firmly, it has to be stopped. And I gave her an example. I did this on Skype. Said, you could say to him something like this: John, you're spinning out of control. You're afraid of things way past what is real or what is reasonable. And it's making you blind. And it's really hurting the people around you, including me. We need to sit down and talk about this right now. And if that makes you late for work, I don't care. We've got to talk about it. And then talk about how his fears are not based in the truth. Fears never are, hardly ever. And he's forgetting what is true. Your love for him, the need for love in your home, and so on. She said, it sounds kind of difficult to do. Possibly, but there is nobody in his life to help him address his fears. Nobody. No therapist. The guys at work are never going to help him address it. You will never see some guy at work come up to another guy at work and go, you know, you've been looking kind of afraid lately. This is never going to occur. Nobody else is going to do it, so it's got to be you. She said, yeah, I hear you. Okay, then it's me. So I've got to wake up and I've got to start getting prepared now. In a later email, she wrote and said, I began to take the phrase that you emailed me and take it in. I played with it. I pulled it apart on the page and I was thinking, okay, I can do this when the moment is right. I can say this to my husband. And one of the big things that made a difference was hearing the tone of voice with which you said it. Max, you're spinning out of control, and it's making you blind and miserable, and it's affecting everybody else. We've always thought that when you, the more straight, the more honest you spoke to somebody, the more harsh the tone had to be. No, not at all. And I really do believe you can do this. Notice, I didn't suggest to you a month ago that you say this kind of thing to him, because you wouldn't have been ready. You couldn't have said it without being on fire, without being in fear yourself. You couldn't have done it. Now, let's move forward in time a few hours later. She wrote me and she said, just now he walked into my office. This is one of the best lines I've ever read. He sat in the chair facing my desk and he said, I'm here to apply for the job of husband. Holy smokes, unbelievable. You are rocking his world. In man talk, I'm here to apply for the job of husband is, I really screwed it up earlier today, and I'm here to beg your forgiveness and start over again. But see, there's no way he knows to say all that other stuff, so he had to say it in some sort of cute, manly way. And he did. She responded to him and said, she sort of fumbled some papers on the desk and said, okay, pretending like she was taking an application, go ahead and tell me your qualifications. This is great. And he actually started saying the Boy Scout law. Now, if you've ever been in the Scouts, you can only say the whole Boy Scout law really fast, because once somebody said to me, would you be willing to give a talk on the items of the Boy Scout law one at a time? You know, so you'd have to say one and then move on to the next one. I discovered I couldn't do it. You learn it so fast that it becomes one word. A Boy Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. That's one word. And her husband started into that as his qualifications for being a husband. Hysterical. He was afraid. He came in and made light of his fear. She paid attention to him. She previously told him kindly that he was fearful. He didn't get it right off, but later he came in to do his version of an apology. It was a miracle between them. Such a thing had never occurred before. And it all happened because she was willing to learn real love. She was willing to learn to feel unconditionally loved. And then she shared it with him, even though he demonstrated absolutely no interest in learning the principles ever. He will never, I'll fall over dead if this man ever goes to a real love meeting. I would be shocked to learn that he ever read a real love book. But he's still teachable. That's all it takes. She's a hero. This is an example of heroism. By the way, so's he. A man wrote that he was in back pain and was really discouraged. He said, when I'm in pain, everything becomes bleak. I hate this. Pain really focuses the mind. It makes you think that pain is all there is, because it's so completely mind occupying. You can be having the greatest day. You can be discussing Henry David Thoreau. You can be discussing world peace. And if I come in and I stab a fork in your leg, suddenly the only thing in the world is the fork in your leg. Pain tends to trump all other feelings. And it makes them seem like they've disappeared. But it's not true. So I said to this guy who sent me an email, the truth is, you're a delightful human being. I've known you for a long time. A good parent, a good spouse, who happens to have pain in addition. Right now, you can't make the pain go away. Right now, you're doing what your doctors say to do. The prognosis looks pretty good, but right now, you take your pain meds to minimize it. You do what you're told to do, and you just let the pain happen. Don't fight it, because that's focusing on it. Or resent it, focusing on it. In other words, feeding it. Just let it go away as you heal. I'm not kidding. It's that simple. People are thinking, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I've actually had my fair share of physical pain. Certainly more than my share of operations. We can be taken down by pain, or we can just be aware of it and continue our lives. Pain doesn't change who we are unless we let it. Now, it's interesting. In 1 week, I got 3 letters about pain, physical pain. Not all at the same time, but I put them all together because they kind of relate to each other. I know a lady who has had chronic knee pain for years and years. I'm pretty familiar with that. And she finally said, my knee hurts so much, I can't continue living with this pain. This pain has made me miserable. And I said, you seem to forget that I've known you for years. Because when your body did work perfectly, when you had no pain at all, you were utterly miserable and wanted to be dead. You don't remember that because the pain we have now tends to take over our perspective of everything. Past, present, and future. What we need is to find emotional happiness or wholeness or healing first, and then several things happen. First, very often I have seen as people become emotionally whole, their physical pain actually goes away because it's estimated by, there's actually a whole branch of medicine now called stress medicine, and these guys estimate that 70% of disease is caused by pain, and they estimate that very close to 100% of disease is at least worsened by pain. So I can't count how many people have been here for an intervention who've been in pain somewhere. Their back, their sinuses, their neck, their whatever. And as they have felt unconditionally loved, they have jerked upright with their eyes wide open and said, I'm not in pain. For the first time in, depends, 3, 5, 10, longer years. Second, our physical, all pain is additive. So when you remove the emotional pain as you heal, the physical pain often seems less. Or 3, we discover that our physical pain is no longer unbearable. It's really important when we have physical pain to not let it take over our lives. Another example, similar to the above. Here's somebody who says, I don't want to be in victimhood thinking. I'm currently detoxing on a medical protocol for removal of lead, the highest level I've had, as well as many other toxic chemicals and heavy metals discovered in my urine test. My body is full of pain. As a result, with a multitude of physical symptoms. As my body ingested this lead in infanthood, I've seen the combination of toxic chemicals creating a soup in my physical system. I'm a real physical victim. Yes, if you ingested lead when you were an infant and off the paint on the walls that nobody knew shouldn't have lead in it, you're a no kidding victim of poisoning as a kid. Yes, you are. You continue. I know that anger is a choice, however. Many times I don't feel like I'm in my body, that there is a choice. Pain clouds my thoughts. That's a fact. I know my anger is always wrong and not conducive to my happiness or ever productive. Yet my body is affected by these toxic heavy metals and chemicals within it. I'm healing emotionally and physically, and I pray that it will occur thoroughly. Real love is a significant tool I use. I know life is meant to be an experience with opposition in all things, but I also know that life is meant to give us joy. I choose to be happy as much as I can because that's the best way to live. Listen to this. This is pretty cool. Can you comment on this opposition of the body and spirit in my situation? Pain is really just part of life. It's part of our spiritual growth. In fact, sometimes we grow the fastest, the deepest spiritually as a result of pain that we've experienced. Pain is not in opposition to our spiritual growth. So physical pain and spiritual growth are not in opposition. They very often work in tandem, and it's all determined by our attitude toward it. I know a man who'd been physically ill for 2 years. Very active man, had had very heavy responsibilities in his life, talented, intelligent. And he said this. It goes on for a couple of minutes, so hang on and listen to his wisdom, because at the time that he wrote this, he was getting pretty old. He said, when I was lying in my hospital bed and for several weeks at home, my physical activity was severely restricted by intense pain. For several weeks, which disabled my weakened body, but I learned the joy of freeing my mind to ponder the meaning of life and the eternities. Wow, that's an attitude. Since my calendar was wiped clean of meetings, tasks, and appointments because I was sick, for a number of weeks I was able to turn my attention away from matters of business and other things to matters of the eternities. I discovered that if I dwelt only on my pain, it inhibited my healing. I found that pondering was a very important element in the healing process for both soul and body. Pain brings you, this is a great line, pain brings you to a humility that allows you to ponder. Ponder is a deeper thing than thinking. It's an experience I am grateful to have endured. In fact, he continued, in the past 2 years, I've waited for the mortal lessons to be taught me through periods of physical pain and mental anguish and pondering. I learned that constant, intense pain is a great consecrating purifier that humbles us and draws us closer to God. If we listen and obey, we will be guided by Him and do His will in our daily endeavors. There were times when I have asked a few direct questions in my prayers, such as, what lessons do you want me to learn from these experiences? I've asked that question more than once myself. Answers were given to me as they have been given to others who have gone through even more severe trials. Dark moments of depression were quickly dispelled by the presence of God, bringing peace and comfort with assurances that all would be well. Notice he didn't say, God didn't come down and poof, make my pain go away. On a few occasions, I told God that I'd surely learned the lessons to be taught. Yeah, I've tried that trick too. Surely I've learned the lessons that I needed to learn, and that it wouldn't be necessary for me to endure any more suffering. I could just see God laughing at me. Such entreaties seemed to be of no avail, for it was made clear to me that this purifying process of testing was to be endured in God's time and in God's way. It's one thing to teach thy will be done, it's another to live it. I also learned that I would not be left alone to meet these trials and tribulations, but that I would be supported and guided and comforted. And there were some that were near angels in the form of doctors, nurses, and most of all, my sweet marriage companion. The experiences of the last 2 years have made me stronger in spirit and have given me courage to speak more boldly to the world the deep feelings of my heart. I can tell you another one that I've learned personally, having had a great number of operations that caused a great deal of physical pain. And it's that at the end of surviving such excruciating pain, sometimes for long periods of time, I learned that I survived, that I lived, that I could feel closer to God and closer to other people. I learned the humility that's required to let other people help you. I became a better person as a result of what I was going to say suffered, but a better word would be experienced. So we tend to look upon pain as something, there are 3 letters in a row. Pain is something that is in opposition to happiness. It's not. It is often through pain that we learn. It is often through pain that we grow. New subject. I know a man who was suicidal, having panic attacks, and said it was no longer worth living. He had a loving experience where he was tenderly held and kissed and hugged and talked to for several days. And the change was beyond miraculous. Every time I've seen him since, for many days in a row, he's been notably happier every single day. After several days of returning home, his daughter saw him, who was unaware of the experience that he'd been through, and said, "Wow, Dad, you look alive and even inspired. You can't fake this kind of happiness." And nothing in all of his decades has ever created this kind of happiness. Love did. Love can heal all wounds. New subject. Lady who's dating online. She said, after going through a great many profiles and reading a great many of them and responding to them and telling them about herself and listening to their responses to her, she said, "How can I say no or no thanks to much older men than I who seem to be nonetheless very genuine and have taken the time to answer my questions? I would like them to find genuine happiness with real love." This lady is in like her mid-20s, and sometimes she would get responses from guys who she would learn later were in their mid-50s, and she thought that was a little old. You first decide whether they're too old. Then, and only you can decide what too old is. Then you say, "Thank you for spending time with me." This is useful for anybody who wants to deliver a loving rejection to somebody online or in person. "Thank you for spending time with me. You have been very kind. I have concluded that we are not a match, but I wish you well, and I hope you'll look more into real love as a source of profound happiness in your life." Look at all the well-wishing and kindness in that. And yet, she states clearly, "I have concluded that we are not a match." Notice she doesn't explain why. If you explain to somebody why they're not a match, they're never going to agree with you. They'll argue with your reasons and, in all likelihood, be offended by them. So you just say, "We're not a match." Kind of hard to argue with that. I was talking recently to a woman who has agonized over doing the right things over and over and over and over. But then she doesn't act. She just has brilliant insights into her behavior, into her past, into the behavior of other people. And my response has lately become pretty consistent. She'll write with some brilliant insight, and at the end of her email, I don't respond to any of the email. At the end of 3 pages of going on and on and on about brilliant insights, most of which are sort of paraphrases of the real love books, I just write one word: move, in all caps. Move. All the talk is blah, blah, blah. In fact, it is by our actions, by our movement, that our true faith is seen. Professing faith takes no effort at all. About as much effort as it takes for me to say to somebody, "I love you," when I don't mean it. Gee, I really have complete faith in that, when I don't. Joan of Arc, at the age of 18 in the year 1430, led the French army. And they were on the verge of the siege of Orléans, which was a major city in France at the time. And she gave a gentle nudge to a hesitant duke who was one of her commanders. Duke, who knows how the French say this, but I'll call him Duke D, because the rest of his name's too difficult. She said, "Forward, gentle Duke," because they were going to assault the castle. "Forward to the assault. Do not doubt." She might just as well have said, "Trust, have faith. The time is right," she says, "when it pleases God, and one ought to act when God wishes. Act, and God will act." Brilliant. When we act, we have a right to ask for the support of all the universe. When we're not acting, when we're sitting on our backsides eating Cheetos watching television, we pretty much don't have the right to ask for any kind of help at all, because we're not moving. I suggested to this particular woman who writes long, long letters professing insights, I said, I make this as a suggestion to you. You can do whatever you want to, but I suggest that you never, ever again write saying to me, "Oh, now I understand," or "Now I see." Because she had learned from attending real love meetings and from reading books, she had learned to substitute her insights for action. And she had learned that people would let her get away with it, and they had for the longest time. It is in our actions that we demonstrate our faith, and in our actions that our faith grows. A people pleaser, and I don't mean that as some sort of deprecating title, but just say it for the sense of shortness, brevity. A people pleaser called me and said that she was confused. She wanted to quit people pleasing, but she works for a boss who has what she calls hair on fire style at work. Everything's always a panic. Everything always has to be done right now. Everything has to be done exactly so. So how, she asked, in that difficult situation, could she possibly avoid people pleasing with a boss like that? Way too complicated to go through all the potential situations where you could stop people pleasing. But I can tell you this, speaking in generalities. There's a big difference between people pleasing with friends and family versus playing a paid role, R-O-L-E, at work. At work, you are paid to assume a role where it is actually your job to please the boss. That's what you're paid for. Many people, as they talk to me about their jobs, are under the misconception that they're paid to do a job. No, you're paid to please whoever it is your supervisor. Whoever it is fills out your evaluations at the end of the quarter or the year. That's who you're paid to please. Just do it. Just to please whoever it is that's evaluating you. But realize that you're doing it, and that you're doing it because it's a role and that you're being paid to do it. And then it's much less likely that you'll feel like a people pleaser as you do it. You're just doing a job. Here's somebody who writes and says, today I found out that one of my husband's old friends had died. I later learned that it was suicide. It stirs something up in me when I see people post pictures of themselves with this guy on Facebook and say things like, "You are so loved," or "You are like a brother to us," or "We will always love you," or "We will always miss you." It just seems to me like they post these pictures to make them look so good to say things like that publicly. Yeah, and we don't really have a right to choose whether any particular person is doing it for that reason. But on the whole, that is what happens when people die. All of a sudden, people come out of the woodwork and wish and express good wishes for the family, the person who's died, even though they haven't seen the person who's died in years. People profess their love after a death. But during the life of that person, they did nothing or nearly nothing to reach out. I had a friend once years ago who died, and I visited with him almost every day for about a year. I visited with him. We talked about his life. At the time, I was a surgeon. Sometimes he just needed medication administered. Sometimes I would do that. And after I'd visited him for 6 months or so, he said, "I'd like you to speak at my funeral." And I said, "Well, what do you want me to say?" And he said, "I want you to tell them the truth about who I was." If you're interested in an interesting pair of books, there's one called Ender's Game, which is my favorite sci-fi book of all time. In fact, when Donna moved down here a million years ago, a couple of the kids came up to her and said, "Have you read Ender's Game?" And she said no. And they said, "Well, you have to read Ender's Game in order to be part of the family." They weren't joking. And then the sequel to Ender's Game is called Speaker for the Dead. And the character in Speaker for the Dead went around all around the universe and did exactly what my friend asked me to do. He would, what he called, speak the life of the person who had died. He would go from the beginning to the end and tell the unvarnished truth about this person so that we could learn from the lessons of the person's life. So I did that. I took this man's history for 6 months, and I stood up at the funeral to deliver the eulogy, and I described how he'd been a bootlegger and an alcoholic, and how his son sitting in the front row was illegitimate, which nobody in the room knew at the time. That was a less than fun moment. That he'd been conceived with the nurse who was taking care of this man who had died with his first wife at the end of her life, and the mother of the illegitimate boy was sitting in the front row with him. So you can imagine how well this went over at the funeral. But he asked me to tell the truth about him. But I also went on to say that despite all the mistakes of his life, all of the failings, the frailties, and so on, there wasn't anything he wouldn't do for you. If you needed $1, he'd give it to you. If you needed 10, he'd give you that. He'd give you whatever he had. If you needed your car fixed, he'd do that. If you needed a ride, he'd do that. If you were drunk and lying in an alley somewhere and needed to be picked up, he'd go pick you up. And I said, possibly the most remarkable thing that I could tell you all sitting here as listening to me speak at this man's funeral is that even though I sat and talked to him every day for a year, not a single person in this room, and there were 250 people there, not a single person in this room did I ever see in that year that I visited him every single day, nor ever heard of visiting him. And I was a little brasher back then. We tend to want to look good. And when somebody's died, not much better opportunity because they're not there to contradict us. This person who wrote the letter said, I'm being critical here, and it's probably my PTSD, but it feels like hypocrisy to me. Like they look good by showing that they were close to him or something. The worst is when someone from church says, how can someone who knows the truth about God and life sink so low that they would take away the life that God has given them because this man committed suicide? That just feels so unkind. It feels terrible to feel like you don't want to live, and then everybody else is going to just sit there and judge you for feeling miserable and never have offered to help you while you were alive when you needed it. You couldn't speak truer words. The writer says, I need to stop thinking about this because it kind of makes me annoyed. Your thinking is completely true. We can be extremely hypocritical, make ourselves look good at the expense of somebody who's died, and then criticize somebody who kills themselves when we have absolutely no idea the extent of the pain in their life and never did a single thing to alleviate their pain while they were alive. So your observations are correct. You could just leave off the anger and it would be, you would feel much happier. New subject. I talked to a man who had been here for an intervention, and he said that when he came, the world had, for years, in his case, decades, been spinning round and round. And in the process, his world was becoming smaller and smaller. To those of you who have never seen one, what he's describing is a whirlpool that just sucks everything down with it. And unwittingly, he was describing his life in that way. He quoted something that he'd read in Real Love and PTSD, where it says, a number of psychologists believe that if we learn from traumatic experiences that we are helpless, this perceived lack of control can lead to depression and other mental illnesses. Seligman and Meyer performed an experiment where 2 groups of dogs were put in harnesses and subjected to electric shocks. Group 1 learned that they could end the shock by pressing a lever, while Group 2's shocks ended in a random way that was completely out of their control. The dogs in group 2 who felt helpless exhibited symptoms identical to clinical depression in human beings. In a later experiment, both groups, the same groups of dogs, were shocked again. And to escape the shocks, all they had to do was jump out of the cage that was electrified over a low partition, low as in 3 or 4 inches, I can't remember the exact number. While group 1 quickly jumped out of harm's way, this was the group that had learned that they could stop the pain by pressing a lever. Most of the dogs in group 2, who had learned helplessness, simply lay down passively and whined, or in human terms, cried, even though the door was open and all they had to do was step out of the cage. But in their depression, they couldn't even see the choice because they'd already learned helplessness. Without choice, we lose hope. We get depressed. The man said, as after he'd quoted this, he said, "Something happened while I was here." He came for an intervention. He said, "I don't feel that way anymore." Love gives us 2 things. First, it gives us the knowledge to make a different choice. And second, it gives us the ability to make a different choice. And I said to him what I would say to you. You see the choice once you feel loved, and you have the ability to make the jump out of the electrocuted cage. Without real love, we only see one choice: to sit, to suffer, to feel depressed, and to whimper. Here's a lady who wrote, "I've started reading Under the Bridge with Joshua, my 10-year-old. He's enjoying reading it together with me at bedtime. Tonight he stopped me reading to tell me about some of his classmates who are having a fallout at school today. He explained that he went to the young girl who was upset, and he explained to her that the children who were being unkind and angry toward her were just feeling empty." This is a 10-year-old after reading a novel. He then took her over to them. He took her by the hand and took her over to the people who'd been unkind. And he said the same to them. "You're just behaving badly toward this girl because you're feeling empty." It seemed to have a peaceful ending. And even if the other children didn't understand, I can see some of it is starting to help Joshua's perception and understanding of situations. He made me smile, telling me that he used an example to the children of how he and his sister have done the same thing to each other in the past. So he wasn't just lecturing them, he also used himself and his sister as an equally bad example of being empty. She said, "I'm feeling blessed to learn real love and to be able to share this with my lovely children." I'm just flat amazed. This kid applies the principles from a novel and changes his behavior at age 10, then teaches others. What a world. Our hope for the future, no kidding, is in educating kids like this. It is we parents who have to get our act together. I have seen one magazine cover after another ask what is wrong with the kids in our world. It's not a kid problem. New subject. Somebody who'd been here for an intervention was talking about maintaining his happiness. He said, "I think the main thing that motivates me is I just can't live like I used to live anymore. I just can't live in that kind of pain." And that is when people really begin to move steadily forward. There is no backward. Now, I didn't learn everything that I needed to in 12-step programs, but I can still remember a guy standing up one day and saying, "You know what keeps me from using again?" He said, "It's not because it's the right thing to do. It's not because of the principles of 12-step. He says, I don't use again because I don't think I have another recovery left in me. I don't, like this man says, I just can't live like that anymore. I can't go back. And he looks like a different person. I talked to him today. He had once wanted to be dead, and now he looks very much alive. And he did what we've all talked about on a great many occasions. He found the love he needed, which he had not known was missing, which he didn't know existed. And when he found it, he trusted it, which after all those decades was a phenomenal act of faith on his part. Then he has been learning to remember it, and eventually he will learn to share it. And his happiness, if he continues on this path, is guaranteed, as it is for all of us. We'll see you in a week.